given the fact that you can have two pronunciations be really far away from each other or not that far away from each other, it might be interesting to sort of extend this, and instead of just taking the average distance over a whole bunch of things, you could also measure the dispersion of distances. So you'd say, the average distance, and then the variance of the distance, or the kurtosis of the distance. You could go first, second, third moments and see what happens. That might be additional useful information. And I said I'd use cluster analysis to kind of group the English people so I can compare them with the Americans. There are a whole bunch of different ways to do this. There are a whole bunch of different measures of similarity you can use. There are a whole bunch of different methods of grouping. Once you've got a measure of similarity, you get a lot of different results depending on how you do it. But typically, the English speakers do tend to group into these 5 regions. The North American regions tend to be distinct. They tend to cluster, if they cluster with anybody in England, they cluster with Southeast England. And interestingly, the East Virginians and the West Virginians cluster so closely together in pretty much any clustering that I've tried that you can't tell that they're different. They might branch out, but then in each branch you'll have some East Virginians and some West Virginians, which kind of surprised me that be the case, but that's what happens. So what do the results look like? Well, if you use the genetic distance or the shared variance, you get basically kind of a similar story. So here's the distribution of results using over all these speakers. Some speakers share as many as 90% of their variance in common. Some speakers, like comparing a couple people, they only share 20% of their variance in common. And then there's a Nay's distance associated with each of those two. So there you see Nay's distance mapped against the shared variance. So here we're mapping the linguistic distance against either the shared variance or the Nay's distance. And you can see how there's just a lot more dispersal with the linguistic distance. For example, if you look at that top graph, you've got shared variance. You can see that there's a blue point, which I can point at. There's a blue point at about 53% and about 0.6 linguistic distance. There's another point which is 53% or so and 1.2 linguistic distance. So here you got two speakers. You're comparing two speakers in each case. In one case, they share 53% of their variance, but the ones that they don't share, the distance isn't all that great. The other one, they share 53% of their variance, but the ones that they don't share, the distance is quite a bit bigger, right? So this is giving you more information in some sense. Maybe misinformation, but it's more information. Here's a sort of mass way of making the comparison, okay? So I'm going to have 3 of these graphs. This is the one for shared variance. What I've done is grouped all the speakers together. And so I've got the East Midland speakers, the East Anglian speakers, the Southeastern speakers, and so on. The Massachusetts speakers, East Virginia and West Virginia. And the color for each little box basically tells you how similar the two speakers are. So for instance, in this box, I'm comparing the West Virginia speakers with themselves. And along the diagonal, that's actually comparing a speaker with him or herself. So the reds mean that these speakers are fairly similar in this aggregate sense. The purple means they're not quite as similar. I've lined up everybody in each group so that the first one is the one who is the most typical speaker in that region using this approach. So the first guy here is, he has the most shared variance on average with everybody else, and then they're ranked in like that. And that's true for each region. Okay? So you look at the English regions, right? You got the purple goes to blue, goes to light blue, goes to green, goes to yellow. That's the increasing dissimilarity, fewer and fewer shared variance. And you see that the English regions, there's a lot more variation than there is in the American regions, right? It just falls right out of the picture. You can see there's just a lot more variation in England. And you can see that the Eastern dialects, or the Eastern speakers, tend to be more like each other than they are like the Western dialects, right? That's what this green tells you is this. These Southwestern speakers are not that much like the East Midland speakers, but the East Midland speakers are more like the East Anglian speakers, right? And so you can see that, and then you can see the Southwest people kind of cluster together with a lot of variation, and then they're not that similar to the Eastern. And the area in the Southeast is a little bit like both. It's a little bit like East Anglia and East Midlands, and it's a little bit like the Southwest, sort of in between. And then you see that the American grouping here, you have the East and West Virginians are actually really quite similar in this aggregate sense. They're not much like people in Massachusetts. But the level of similarity is sort of like the level of similarity between, say, the Southeasterners and the Southwesterners in England. It's about the same kind of aggregate similarity, you could say. And then sort of key point here this is what kind of fell out of LAVIS that I find interesting is, you look at the Massachusetts speakers, and what are they like? Who are they like in England? Well, they're like the East Midlands folks, and they're like the Southeastern folks more than anybody else. They're not much like them, but they're not that different. But they're really not like Southwesterners. They really don't share a lot of variants in common with Southwesterners, right? Massachusetts speech is not Southwestern speech, not much like English Southwestern speech. But it's more like the East Midlands and the Southeast. But by the time you look at the West Virginians, the pattern is much more varied, right? They share a lot more variants in common with everybody, and in fact, they share a lot of variants in common. They share the most variants in common with people in Devonshire, way off in the west. It's kind of interesting. So what happens if you use Nay's genetic distance and you do the same thing? Well, you get about the same story. It's a little bit different. It's different people line up and stuff, but it's basically the same story. What about the linguistic distance? Again, it's basically about the same story. So that's kind of interesting. You can use these different approaches and you still basically tell the same story, right? The Massachusetts speech is most like kind of the area around London, a little bit more like East Midlands, and then not really like the Southwest, right? And then the Virginians, well, they're more like the area around London, but then they also have a bunch of features, or they seem to have similar features to elsewhere, and a lot more similarity over here with Devonshire. That's kind of interesting. So then, there's all this other stuff I can go into, but I'm running out of time, so I won't. But it's all in the handout. And then I wanted to point this out. If I take the averages, compare the average distance according to these three measures between these different regions, so East Midlands, East Anglia, Southeast, and so on, and Massachusetts, East and West Virginia. If you use the shared variance approach or the Nay's distance approach, this is what I want to point out, is that look at Massachusetts shared variance compared to everybody else. East Midlands is the first English group that comes up, right? They're most like East Midlands according to shared variance, most like the East Midlands according to Nay's distance, and like the Southeast for the linguistic distance. Then look over here at West Virginia. It's Devonshire, Southeast. So all the American regions measured on this linguistic distance, they're most similar to the Southeast around London. But then, according to these, they actually share more variance with these Virginians share more variance with these Western English, but they're least dissimilar to the people in the Southeast. And then if you use the typical speakers using these measures, you get exactly the same story. It's kind of interesting. I didn't expect that. But there's Devonshire, Surrey, right near London. But over for Massachusetts, it's Rutland, Lincoln. So it's a different story depending on how you do it. So conclusions are you've got these different measures. They yield somewhat different but complementary insights into linguistic variation. By all measures, there's a whole lot of variation in every region and among regions. The pattern of variation, I thought, is kind of interesting. I thought about this for a while and I realized it's a lot like species-area relationship, right? In biology, you have this relationship that says the bigger an area, the more species you're going to find in it. And the longer an area has been have a constant kind of habitat, the more species you're likely to find in it. That's kind of what shows up with this, right? You've got more people in southern England, so guess what? There's more variation. And it's been settled longer, so there's more variation. You look at the American regions, they haven't been settled as long, and these regions have fewer people than the English regions, and so there's less variation. I would conclude that American settlement resulted in lower variation in American regions, leveling, and somewhat different populations of variance in different regions. There's a little bit of dominant influence from the metropolitan area, but it's not real strong. There's somewhat greater influence, eastern influence in the north, somewhat greater western influence in the south. There's relatively little innovation, which is something I want to talk about further if I had more time to go through. But there's really very few of these American variants are not found somewhere in England. Like very, very few of them.